Hello. I want to welcome all of you, say thank you for joining us today for this panel discussion. I am Kathy Lee. I'm an associate with BRW Architects, and as your panel moderator, I'm very excited today and looking forward to this enlightening conversation on the integration of diversity designing for inclusion. So most of us understand the basic principles of universal design. Do we really understand design and educational goals collectively? Because the needs of all learners can vary greatly, by combining these two objectives, we can promote engagement and inclusion and increase awareness and access. In this discussion, we will examine planning and design influences and the benefits of designing for diversity. Today, we're joined by a group of distinguished individuals that are excited to be able to speak with you about why it's so important that designers and educators alike integrate diversity in today's learning environments. I want to take this opportunity to briefly introduce all of our panelists and then give each of you a moment to elaborate on your specific expertise. Anne Hildenbrand, Associate Principal with BRW Architects, has been designing educational facilities for most of her 25-year career. She truly believes the physical space in which children learn is equally as important as what they are learning. Monica Simons is the Director of Advanced Learning Programs and Services with Richardson ISD. Monica regularly speaks at the state and national level on equity in education and has a developed expertise in high ability learners. Ashley Jones joins us today from Highland Park ISD and is the elementary STEAM instructional coach for the district. Ashley is a champion of cultivating children's strengths and believes connecting them with meaningful learning will help to develop thoughtful, capable individuals. And last but not least, we have Beth Sheehan. Beth joins us from the Richardson ISD Council of PTAs, Special and Gifted Education, and currently serves as the coordinator for Understanding Differences program. Beth believes that universal design is fundamental to meet the needs of all learners. This is a registered AIA course for continuing professional education, and upon completion of the course, certificates will be available. In today's discussion, we're going to identify the benefits of designing for diversity, explore the basic principles of universal design, discuss presentation approach and different learning styles. And when you leave here, you will have the knowledge to carry on this important conversation. The 7 principles of universal design, also known as UDL, were developed in 1997 by a working group of architects, engineers, environmental design researchers, product designers, all led by the late Ronald Mace in the North Carolina State University. The principles of universal design promote the inclusion of all people in all activities of life and is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on the scientific insights into how people learn. So my first question for all of you today is simple. As we try to understand the principles of universal design, what do you believe to be the greatest benefit of inclusive design? And as you answer the question, if you would just please elaborate a little more on who you are and your expertise. Anne, why don't you start us off?
Sure, I'm Anne, and I'm an architect by profession, but more importantly, I'm a mother of 2 boys. They're now in the 5th and 7th grade. And what really opened my eyes to this is that they have learning differences. They're very individual, and how they learn is very unique, and what their needs are very unique. For me, the most important thing to offer in a learning environment is a diverse space, a space where both the teacher and the children have choices. And my number 2 is a window. And I have to tell a small story about this. Is recently we were renovating a 1950s elementary school, and has beautiful windows, and all the roller shades were down, and the roller shades were covered with great art by the kids and their projects, but they couldn't see outside and they didn't have natural daylight. So this was a great learning experience for me, was to provide plenty of places for kids to put up their projects in the classroom so they didn't need to use the windows.
That's great, Anne. Monica, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you believe inclusive design is so important?
Thank you. I'm Monica, and I've been in education for 30 years, a little more than 30 years, and I've been in 2 states and multiple districts. And so what that has given me is an opportunity to see lots of different ways that learning environments have been implemented and what has worked and what has not. When I was in Louisiana, I worked with gifted children who were part of special education. And a lot of my understanding of learning differences comes from that, seeing the spectrum of students with their abilities and their learning styles. In my most recent position here in Texas, I have been able to witness students who have lots of challenges in their learning. Sometimes their learning environment includes the pace at which they are learning. It can also include the environment in which they are learning, everything from sound to light to the type of desk, whether it's hard or soft. Is it movable? Can they sit alone? And so on. And so understanding personalized learning and trying to find ways to make the environment meet the students has been a really big priority for me.
That's awesome. Ashley, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Ashley, and I've been in education for 13 years, but I didn't start off in education. I actually was a journalism major, and I worked at some different news outlets here in Dallas, and I got into teaching. But I have to tell you, Kathy, that whenever I was in school, I never thought I did anything right, and I thought I was always wrong. And it took me until I was 35 to think I was actually smart when it came to education. And that was in grad school. And I was doing things that I liked. I was applying myself in ways that I liked. And I feel like that's how education should be today. I feel like whenever you have universal learning environments, you are developing a culture of respect and belonging. And that was really hard for me to find growing up. And I feel like when you create that culture in the classroom, it makes things like STEAM and collaboration just that much easier. And so, whenever kids come into my classroom, I want to focus on their strengths and not their weaknesses. And I want them to feel empowered every single time they leave my class.
That's great. Ashley, you are a fantastic teacher. I have to slip this in here personally. Ashley taught my now 6th grader in 3rd grade. So very, very lucky to have had Ashley as a teacher. And Beth, why don't you let us know a little bit about you?
Great. Thank you, Kathy. I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation today. I think I loved the idea of universal design before I knew that there was a term universal design. And I've been in education for 25 plus years, as well as a special education teacher in the beginning, working with ages from pre-K all the way up through 12th grade. And I think early on, part of my decision in choosing special education was that I believed that every child could learn. And I believe we've had lots of discussions lately about the rights to education. And I fully believe that every individual has the right to an education where they can be lifelong learners. And I think universal design does a wonderful job of creating a framework to make that possible for students. And early on in special ed, we're all about labels, and a lot of times those labels dictate the physical environment that kids are in, and then also the curriculum that they participate with. But universal design sort of levels the playing field to a certain extent and allows children to come into an environment and participate in that learning experience just along the same lines as their non-disabled peers. So I think that's really empowering. And we've been working on the idea of inclusion since the early 90s when it became part of the terminology of special education mandates. but I don't think we've fully realized it yet. And I think with universal design, we're getting a little bit closer to doing that. And I'm super excited to see that happen. You asked me also to mention what I'm currently doing, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but I am currently in the volunteer position of coordinator for Understanding Differences, which is a disability simulation program, which is sort of a stepping off point to how we are showing kids that everybody has differences and we all can learn, and it just might look different from your neighbor. And so hopefully we'll spend a little more time talking about that, so you'll have a chance to see what that looks like.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear more about that program later on in the presentation too, Beth. You know, it's interesting. I think all of you work with different types of learners and diverse students. You know, we recognize diversity as an understanding that all of us are unique individuals with different needs, different abilities, different preferences. Diversity is such an important issue. That's why, you know, I'm so excited that we're here talking about this today, because there are so many different types of diversity in the classroom. And since we know that one learning environment does not fit all, I'm hoping that all of you can help us understand the value that inclusive design brings to the students, the different types of learners that you work with. Ashley, let me start with you. Can you describe to us the importance of a dedicated space for STEAM instruction?
Absolutely. The importance of a dedicated STEAM space for instruction is just to give kids that creative outlet to stop and to think and to tinker. You know, I thought about it one day. You know, the kids were at specials, and, you know, I sat and I checked my phone, and, you know, I kind of doodled a little bit, and I played with some Legos. You know, I just kind of gave myself the opportunity to just kind of be. And I realized that my kids needed to do that in the classroom as well. And so I started doing STEAM, not really knowing I was doing STEAM, and I've been in some great districts and I've learned a lot. And early on, people kept asking me why. Why are you giving students choice? Why are you not grouping students, you know, homogeneously? Why are you doing all these things? And so I kept having to explain to them that just because a student can't do something in this capacity doesn't mean they can't do it in another. Just give them the opportunity. And so they kept asking me why. And it was pretty amazing. About 12 years later, they finally started asking me how. And so to fast forward to this conference, it's amazing to see how many teachers give students choice and give students voice and give students flexibility. You know, STEAM isn't that thing they have to earn. It's not that cool project that if you do all this, then you get to do this. It's just embedded within, you know, math rotation, science, social studies, all the things. And I think kids get really excited knowing that they can create, they do have a way they can contribute. And I think that also helps with social and emotional learning. You know, so many kids think they can't, and they just, you know, sit back in class and they think nobody cares. But when it comes to STEAM and it comes to those spaces and those learning environments, you know, they do know and they understand that people care and they want to hear what they have to say, and they're a part of that team. And again, it comes back to, you know, creating that learning environment and creating that safe space for kids to have that voice. And it might not be right every time, and that's okay. And I think there's such pressure on kids now to be perfect, to get it right every time, that with STEAM, you know, they get those moments to just try, and it'll crumble and it'll fail, but it gives them the tools that they need to regroup, reassess, and just try again. And so, you know, when there's more collaboration, there's more engagement, and it's just exciting whenever students know that they can work on, it's not just a craft, it's a project. And I call it purpose-based learning. So whenever students, you know, are learning something in class, they're quickly applying it in a real world situation, you know, whether it's building a tiny house and working on area and perimeter, you know, stuff like that. It gives them a reason to listen to the learning and then apply the learning.
I agree. I think that's so fantastic. STEAM is really exciting for parents. It's, you know, the opportunities that our kids are being given. It's exciting for parents to hear about when kids come home and they talk about it. So I think that's great. Beth, can you talk a little bit about CAST and their mission of designing engaging learning environments?
Sure. So CAST stands for Center for Applied Technology, and this is a small group of technology and education innovators back in the 80s around the Boston area that felt like there were better ways to reach the needs. And really specifically, they were looking at learning differences. And it did start out heavy with a technology focus because I think that was their area of expertise. But as they dug into it a few more years, they realized that this wasn't just the technology piece that we were looking at when the Macintosh had just been introduced. So of course there was this big push and desire for technology to really enhance the learning experience. But this group realized that there was more to it, that the idea of providing options and a better learning experience for all learners, including learners with disabilities and learning differences, there could be a design to it. And so they started calling this new framework universal design for learning, which is where in education, when we talk about universal design, we typically refer to UDL. That led to, and that was that involved the curriculum, not as much of the space, but it involved the curriculum, it involved the way kids cognitively process information, and how you're actually designing education for children. It was truly innovative at the time because, and even now in education, we move slowly sometimes when we don't, I wouldn't say educators are always innovators for one reason or another. So it truly was an innovation in thinking that, because when schools get curriculums, a lot of times they're curriculums out of a box. It's a one size fits all, and you're operating with teaching those kiddos what comes out of that curriculum. They get a test on it, great, they've mastered it, you move on. They don't master it, you might move on too. Well, universal design, they created 3 principles, and which you see on your screen now, that include engagement, representation, action, and expression. The idea was you take every student, regardless of their learning differences or their gifted traits or whatever they might have, and you can apply these 3 principles. And if you can get a learner to engage in whatever activity they're doing, then you're going to motivate that learner. If you are providing representation of the lessons and the curriculum that you want those children to learn, say in math, in multiple ways, then you are ticking the boxes of all those kids. You might have 3 kids sitting in your classroom and they all respond and engage to math in a very different way. Some may need manipulative, some may need to write it out, some may need to hear it. So the opportunity to have those pieces provided in multiple ways of representation also support kids wanting to be engaged in learning. Because we know that if kids are engaged, they're going to be learning and they're going to be making progress. And that's what we all want, right? When our kids go to school, we want to see them move forward. So then the last part of that is action and expression. And we want, like I sort of mentioned, is what was really important to me when I started my education. I want my students to be lifelong learners. I want them to come into my classroom, acknowledge their strengths, build on those strengths, work on their weaknesses, and know that whatever tools they're getting in school, they're going to be able to take it for a lifetime. And that's part of the third piece of in UDL is understanding, is trying to build that in students, that strategic taking on learning for themselves, which if you do that, then you've got it made. So once you get out of school, then you'll continue to be a learner and a great citizen of this world. So I think what the mission that CAST has now said, and cast.org is their website. It's a great resource for all things UDL and information about how other people across the world are implementing UDL. But their mission statement is to transform education design and practice until learning has no limit, which I think just says exactly what we are all talking about. Like, how exciting is that for kiddos to come home and say, look what I learned today, and carry that on through their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is what we're all talking about. There are no limits. So thank you for explaining CAST to us. Monica, like the other panelists, the physical spaces the gifted students work in can be fundamental to success too. The ability to move around and work independently has been shown to positively impact educational growth. What strategies are gifted education programs using in creating these specific learning zones?
I want to piggyback on what Beth and Ashley have said. I think they brought up some really great points, and there are some myths involved with students who would be considered gifted learners that they're going to get it regardless. And so often there is little attention paid to students who have high abilities or they are already high achieving. And as your slide earlier said, and as Beth talked about, there are students who are twice exceptional. So they are gifted and something else. They have different characteristics. And it's really important that, as Ashley mentioned earlier, we play to their strengths. We look at their strengths, and what we have found is that when you work with someone's strengths, their relative weaknesses will come along and they will be strengthened through that. And so if we can find the learning environment that works best for them, then we are going to unleash potential. So when we are dealing with high ability learners, we need to remember, as the panelists have said, one size does not fit all. And all gifted students are not created the same. They don't have the same strengths, and they don't have the same learning styles. And I love that Anne brought up the blinds and that they remained down so the kids could see the art, but that wasn't letting light in, because a lot of our students who are high ability come with overexcitabilities. These overexcitabilities can be debated in different circles, but certainly there are these levels of intensities that come with them. And so they can be affected by their environment. You'll often find that we don't have a lot of light on in the classrooms that have a high percentage or all students who are highly able and gifted. And that is because they can be distracted by those lights. They also are very sensitive to them. I would say that you walk through a lot of offices in my building and there will be very dim lights in there. But to Anne's point, there does need to be natural light, because we know that when we don't have natural light and can't see outside, we can be depressed by it. And I don't mean depression, I just mean our thoughts and creativity can be depressed by it. So there has to be a balance between light and the kind of light that we receive. And we do know fluorescent lights can be problemsome with a lot of our kids. The other thing is sound. We often use white noise or ambient sounds for our students because it can drown out some of the distracting sounds or sights that may be around them. When we put our students together, our GT students, we often will have them in a cross-grade environment. I know that some cognitive loads have been discussed. That is because our students progress asynchronously. And so I loved that Ashley talked about SEL, social emotional learning. We can have a 10-year-old student who is 10 years old. And we need to remember he's 10 years old. Cognitively, he might be 15 or 16 and can process at that level. Emotionally, he might be 8. And so we need to remember that the ages of the students depend on which part of their characteristics that we are talking about. Also, they may have different strengths in different academic areas. So it's important that we group them together at least at times in ways so that they are definitely growing their areas of strength. So you might have a 3rd grader and a 6th grader working on the same level in math. That might call for different size furniture or different types of environment for them to move around in. So flexibility is really crucial for that. And then again, allowing students to work alone or work with others and let that ebb and flow throughout the day.
Yes, I agree. It's interesting. You talked about the 10-year-old. I have an almost 12-year-old who looks like he's 15. So I often have to remind myself that he's 11 still. So next I want to go into planning and design influences and consideration. And Monica, you just touched on several key points. I think just the same Ashley and Beth have as well. And we know that lighting can affect a student's cognitive performance, and acoustics can have a direct impact on speech intelligibility and auditory comfort. Can you walk us through some of the design considerations in achieving an inclusive educational environment?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So this is an overview of the kinds of spaces we'll be looking at. I'm going to focus more on the physical. We have a great panel that knows a lot more about the emotional needs of the students and how they learn, but I'm going to talk about ways we can make their learning environment better to provide all those choices. And we just heard about the variety of spaces, and Monica also hit on the lighting and the acoustics. They're all really important in providing the right environment for us to learn in. Can you go ahead and advance to the next one?
Oh.
So cognitive mapping, this is our ability to use our senses, all of our senses, touch, smell, sight, and hearing. And not all of us have the best sight, not all of us have the best hearing, but it's our ability to use those senses to understand where we are in the space and to navigate and interact in that space comfortably. So I remember my first day of school, whether it was in elementary school or in college, if it was a new building and I went into that building and it was a maze of white corridors and nothing was distinguished from the other corridor, there was no color, there was no daylight, there were no views, there was no wayfinding. It made my day really rough, right? And it took me probably a couple of weeks to feel really comfortable in that building to where I knew how to navigate my way through it. So the importance of wayfinding is critical. Wayfinding meaning it could be major graphics, it could just be a room sign, it could be color themes. So you might theme a certain wing or floor or grade so that the kids know and they have ownership in that space. It could be a simple monumental stair in the space in the center of the lobby. And so you know when you're in that space, you know where you are in that building at that time. It's also important in the classroom that there's some order to that classroom. And that doesn't mean boring repetition, but it means perhaps not tons of clutter, there might not be a lot of places where you're just tripping over things. But some sense of order in that classroom really helps kids feel secure and safe. Let's go to the next slide. So areas of refuge. This is a little space that we designed for an early childhood center. And it's a little nook in the corner of the classroom. It's secluded, but it also, although it's private for the student, it's also visible from all parts of the classroom, so that teacher has constant supervision. But that child's able to get down on the floor, get comfortable on the carpet, curl up with a book. They might just need a little bit of quiet time because there's an activity that they're doing. Maybe they're doing research or whatever it is, or it's a place where the teacher can take a small group and read with them. But if you'll notice at the top of this space, there's a lot of little lights. Those are LED lights. And those lights are dimmable depending on the amount of daylight that comes from that skylight from the top. So during the day, those lights will actually dim depending on how much daylight. So again, the space has natural light, but it's an area where they feel real safe and secure. And some kids just might need that little corner to curl up in to rejuvenate themselves. I know I do because I'm an introvert. So every now and then I need to get rejuvenated and have some time to myself. Again, those transitional zones that are clearly defined so you know when you're coming from one area to the other are super important. So let's say you're coming from a collaborative space into a more typical classroom wing, or you're transitioning from a corridor to the 5th grade wing. You want to know that you are in this transitional space and that you have arrived. And those transitional spaces might have common materials or again, some sort of color theme to signify you are in this transitional space. And this is your little area that maybe you just need some time to yourself and time out before you enter into that next space. And it's also important as you're traveling through the building that you can see what's coming next. So what's very helpful, for example, is to have maybe that window at the end of the corridor that's framing this beautiful tree. So they have that connection to the outdoors throughout the day, and they right away know which way they're oriented in that building and what's coming next. In the next slide. Mobility. We all understand that being able to move about a space is important and create those different little learning environments within the space. I think what's missing here is the comfortable beanbag, but you'll notice that all these chairs and the tables, they have casters. The kids can stand or sit. They have easy access to things they might need for projects. So this lends itself really well to project-based learning, which I feel is very collaborative approach to learning. And it promotes inclusivity in the classroom. So little things just like providing options for the furniture can make people feel like they have options and they feel more comfortable. A wiggle chair, this is super important for certain kids to be able to have that mobility and move around, and that would help a lot as well. And I think the final one here is this sense of place. Here, this sense of place is an outdoor courtyard. You get to go outside and eat lunch here. You can do a student project out here, but you have that connection to nature, which we need throughout the day. We need to either see it and feel it with our senses, but what's also really nice about this space is it's very secure. It's not in a parking lot. It's not out in the middle of a field. You're surrounded by the building and you created this secure space. Well, these can also be spaces inside the building, but it's a place like a maker space where the kids and the teachers can make it their own and be flexible with what they're doing in the space. And now the next slide, I think that's the final one. So this is a great space where this child feels comfortable, has a real connection to the outdoors, has views and natural light. Not only do we need natural light, but we need lighting in the classroom that doesn't produce glare. So it's really nice when the teacher can control that lighting, or when the lighting dims because of the amount of natural light that's produced from the windows. Natural ventilation, when you can get it, is great. If you have up-to-date HVAC systems that mix in some fresh air to that system, is wonderful. If the teacher has their own thermostat because you have your own individual rooftop unit for each classroom, that's even better. And just providing a window in the classroom, just the thought that you can actually open a window during the day, whether you're going to use it or not, makes the teacher and those students feel more comfortable. I'm not going to go into the acoustics. Monica already brought that up, but very important that everybody hears the teacher, that you can hear yourself, that there's not a lot of reverberation in the space and echo. So some soft surface, whether it's on the floor, the wall, or the ceiling, helps with that. And of course, when you can, making those walls not transfer the sound as much is wonderful. Color, believe it or not, color really influences how we feel. The blue slides were very intentional. Those make us feel calm. For example, that blue color and those soft colors make us feel calm, but some people need something brighter than that, a red or an orange, just to activate them again. And also materials are really important. We use our senses in so many different ways. We want to feel and be able to touch some things that are different, not all hard surfaces. So I think I've said enough about the learning environments. We'll keep on going with our next topic.
So all of that is so interesting to me, and to see some of these spaces that are either being transformed or just designed or just incredible. Um, does anybody else on the panel want to weigh in on different considerations when designing?
I will.
Okay.
I had none of those things whenever I had a classroom. I had an old closet that had 3 windows that were 10 feet above everywhere else. And you literally had no idea if it was raining or snowing or anything else. We had no natural light. We had no window to open. We had nothing. And so I think that's why it was really important that I transform that space into an experience. And so, you know, the walls were bright blue, like electric blue and electric green. And I thought, I can't do this. So painted everything like a neutral gray, and then added pops of color with things like dinosaurs and bats and, you know, all sorts of like colorful paint splotches, and it looked like slime was dripping down from the walls. And so I had to come at it from another standpoint of, I don't have all these really cool natural elements that could bring calm to my classroom. So, I mean, I couldn't even turn off all the lights. If I did, it was pitch black. So it was definitely a great space as a tornado shelter. But I had to find a way to make it warm and inviting for kids. And so I turned it into a giant science lab. So kids would walk past and be like, is this the science lab? And I would say, nope, it's just the 3rd grade classroom. And so it made it fun for those kids who were in a cave with rope lights and table lights, and just constantly changing manipulatives and things to bring them calm within the classroom.
Ashley, I love what you brought up there, and Anne, what great information. I would just want to talk a little bit about sensory materials, because I don't think any one of us would sit very still all day and not be able to function without some sort of fidgeting happening. And yet a lot of times educational environments are created so that students are in rows in hard desks, and they're expected to sit for very long periods of time. And I think now that we've all been on Zoom quite a bit lately, we can agree that we as adults don't want to do that ourselves. And so the sensory materials have been really good. I've even seen products come across my social media feed for things that you can just rub that bring a sense of calm to you. Why did fidget spinners become really popular? And it's because it allowed kids to spin something, to move around, and allowing the light and the sound, the colors and everything to become part of that sensory material. We can find our space where we can learn the best. And that goes back to one of the original slides about equity. We need equity of opportunity for students to learn, and that includes the environment in which they learn.
Yeah, and Kathy, I can just add to you that because Anne was talking about this, and when we first started thinking about this presentation topic, the first thing I thought of was a preschool classroom. For a long, long time, the preschool classroom has embraced a universal design method, and it in the fact that the universal design learning, the UDL, that curriculum education piece, along with what Anne is talking about in that physical space, the universal designing your environment, because preschoolers operate in centers, right? When we think of a typical preschool classroom, we think of centers. And if someone walked in and just off the street, they would just think that those 4-year-olds were just playing with blocks, or they're having a great time reading a book, or maybe there's a sensory table or whatever, and it's great playtime. But if you dig deeper, you realize that the teacher has been really savvy and worked long hours. I would argue sometimes to create that perfect space, it takes a longer time for a teacher to facilitate than it does to work out of a workbook, because she or he has created those centers that have embedded learning, very specific learning pieces for those kids that are going to take where they are developmentally and build so we see that progress in learning. And so it looks like play, it looks like a great environment for centers, but there's been lots of deliberate thinking when it comes to how to make that space universally fit. It also is a space that was one of the first places that naturally, children with disabilities, we found naturally inclusive situations happening, because even though the developmental levels might be different or the learning needs might be different, children can go in and play with an item in a center together, even though they might be playing with it differently or learning with it differently. They can sit side by side and work in that center however they needed to work in that center. So my hope for this, and I love seeing Anne's slide about the University of Texas graphic for that environment, is we think of young kids. I think it's easy for us to think of young kids in these spaces that really promote optimal learning. And it's harder, like Monica said, we've got kids sitting in rows and desks. I think it's harder for even educators to visualize what that looks like for older kids. So it's exciting to hear this conversation and see more educational spaces for our older kiddos reflect more of that young learning space where they can truly be engaged.
Yeah, I agree. This has been a very interesting conversation. Ashley, I was personally involved with the classroom there. My now almost 12-year-old actually came home and we had to cut out slime to put it on our walls to emulate the classroom there. And Beth, I think you bringing the point that, the preschool class is the universal design model right there. And then Monica, what you talk about, I think it's all very interesting and great that we're having this conversation. I want to move to state funding within K-12 budgets. So, school districts across the nation are starting to implement disability awareness programs similar to Understanding Differences with Beth. Beth is going to share a little bit about that program in order to help students understand what it's like to live with a disability. In addition, there's a growing trend of state funding for school mental health support services within K-12 budgets. Beth, can you help explain a little bit more about the Understanding Differences program? And then I would welcome the rest of the panel to talk about any other programs that are funded through the state.
Sure, absolutely. Do we have a slide? For UD, we also call Understanding Differences UD, so I've got a lot of UD acronyms floating around in my head at the moment, but Understanding Differences is a disability simulation awareness program that is not necessarily exclusive or unique. Like Kathy mentioned, there are a variety of these programs around the United States in different areas. The program that RISD PTA, in conjunction with RISD, provides came about 8 years ago, and it was some volunteers. We have our PTA committee of special and gifted education, and that is just a subcommittee of the PTA that is parents supporting parents and teachers and children that have diverse learning needs. So there was a kit found in a closet of Understanding Differences. And so some parent volunteers pulled that kit out and realized that it was a disability awareness program. And since then, we've had lots of hands in it. We've tweaked it. We've built on it in the past 8 years to have the program that we have now. And it consists of children going, it's about an hour and a half program. They come to, right now we're set up for a junior high facility. They come to the gym and they get to go through 7 different stations where they get to experience mobility impairment, visual impairment, dyslexia, hearing impairment. I'm going to leave a couple out, but sensory impairments. There's that simulates what it might be like for a student who's on the autism spectrum disorder. And so we bring students in and we talk about, the first thing we talk about before the kiddos get to go through the station is we introduce Understanding Differences. So we just talk about differences that everybody has differences. And that is how we set it up, is that we have them look at each other and recognize that we all look different, we all like different things, and that we are celebrating those differences. And what we want them to get out of that day, we tell them that what we expect from them is to be open to what they're experiencing, that they ask lots of questions. It's a safe place to ask respectful questions, and just to learn a little bit about what someone else's experience who might have a visual impairment, what it might be like for them to do that. Part of the belief in why these disability simulation programs are important is that it teaches empathy, and that we also introduce vocabulary to the kiddos and we talk about what empathy is. And the difference between empathy and sympathy is really important, because empathy, we want everyone to feel empathetic. We want someone to, even though you might not be experiencing what someone else is experiencing, we want someone to understand, and we want our kiddos to have a feeling of taking on what someone else might be experiencing and be empathetic to that. Versus sympathy, where you're feeling sorry for someone. Like, you can be sympathetic to what someone is going through, but we don't want pity to enter into someone that has a disability, feeling sorry that their life is less than a typical person might be experiencing. Because we bring it back to, we all have differences, and at some point in our lives, we've all experienced a challenge that we've had to try to figure out how to navigate. And so, by teaching empathy and building that awareness in those kiddos, we hope that it bleeds out into the idea of, if you're empathetic, one thing that research says that is one of the biggest deterrents to bullying and being victims of bullying is to have that piece of empathy. When students are bullying, we find that it's because one part, they aren't empathetic to someone else. They haven't had that experience. They don't understand what it might be like for someone else to be feeling what they're feeling. So that is a really important goal for programs like Understanding Differences. Along with that, as we go through, it goes back to the piece that I spoke about, not promoting the pity and the sympathy piece, is that as the kids go through the station, we also talk about what adaptations might be happening if you do have that disability. Like Mirror Mirror is the dyslexia simulation station, and in that, the kids are having to trace a star in a box using a mirror. So they can't look at their hand; they have to look at a box to use their mirror. It literally makes your brain process how to do that star in a different way. So we talk about, when you have dyslexia, it doesn't mean that you can't learn and that you aren't as capable as the person sitting next to you. It means that your brain is processing the information in a different way, and you just have to figure out how to make that work. And so we also talk about how they might have student friends that go to a class that has dyslexia training in it, and so that they can learn some of those skills to adapt to how their brain processes. We talk about in the Let's Move station the adaptations that someone might use to, if they have limited mobility, to navigate through the cafeteria or navigate how to carry their books down the hallway. There's one of the stations that is not that I've left out that is on the screen is a communication station, and we actually have iPads that are communication boards. And so if an individual has a communication disorder and they need a way to communicate, then they can use a communication board, which is a series of pictures, and a way for them to create sentences and communicate with a typically hearing or typically speaking individual. And so we show them a variety of adaptations and a variety of tools that allows people to work alongside their peers. So, and that's really important, because you don't want to get stuck in the, oh, I'm so glad I don't have what you have, because that's really hard. We want to say, yes, we all have differences. Sometimes they're challenging, but look at the cool tool that I have to use that allows me to communicate in a really cool way with you. Or look at the way I learn to decode my words so that I can read this book along with you. So it goes back to just understanding we all have differences, and we're celebrating that. One last piece that I want to add that's really, really important in the last few years we added was, you see the wrap up on the screen. We invite, and we have some of our volunteers are also differently abled individuals. We invite a guest speaker to each of our sessions to come in and talk about their different abilities. We've had a college student who is on the Paralympian basketball team, as you can see in that picture, who went to Peru and they won gold at the Olympics one year, and super exciting to hear her talk. She's really, really fun. We've also had students come in and speak about their learning differences and what it's like as an 8th grader to experience a learning difference in school and how they have worked through that and the things that have helped them. So we want to normalize. I think that's part of the inclusion piece and what we talk about with universal design is we want this normalization. You know, when I started special ed, we were just moments out of special ed being in the schools. We passed that milestone. We had laws that said our kiddos needed to be educated with their peers. But that just meant in the building. It didn't mean in the classroom. So you had classrooms of children that had disabilities at the end of the hallway. I vividly remember in my elementary school, we all knew what that classroom was. And rarely did those children interact with the rest of us. That's not the case anymore. And part of what goes along with that conversation is normalizing and the acceptance of how we're all different. And we might require notes from a teacher to help us take the social studies test when someone else is writing their own notes. We might require assistive technology to take a test, but we all do it together. And if one person may need that one day, but another day you might need some special assistance doing something. So we want, as understanding differences, we want to help bridge that gap. And I believe it helps build this idea where we can have the universal design and we have kiddos in our classrooms that it truly is inclusive. We're not sectioning kiddos off and separating kiddos out anymore through that process. And universal design, UDL, and universal design learning, specifically takes everybody at the beginning. The teacher will look at what they all need, and then he or she will design their learning to fit what each of those kiddos need. And you might, when you dig deep into the paperwork, you might realize that you have a kiddo that has a label, especially if you like our label, working on something, and then you've got a kid next to them working on something similar but maybe slightly different. But you'd only know that if you looked at the lesson plan. You wouldn't know that when you walked into a classroom. And we want the kids to have that sort of acceptance level and that understanding of not being in shock when you